In the grounds of Nanpantan Hall can be found lawns, formal borders, woodland glades, and a walled garden with adjacent orchard, which in its heyday provided fruit, vegetables and flowers for the hall and its residents. The siting and design of the gardens was dictated to a large extent by the topography and geology of the Charnwood Forest. Being situated on one of the higher points in the forest, there is little level ground, and the underlying rock creates a thin, acidic and stony soil with heavy subsoil which is prone to waterlogging. The climate is frequently wetter and colder than in nearby Loughborough. Thus, the creation of lawns in front of the hall required terracing, and the walled garden had to be sited a distance from the hall on a sloping, south-facing site. The flower beds edging the hall frontage were planted formally, but in the walled garden there were twin herbaceous borders lining a path, and many beds of flowers grown specifically for cutting. Together, the walled garden and orchard cover an area of nearly 2 acres. Even with a house full of guests, it is hard to see how the family could consume the quantity of vegetables grown, so it is likely that their servants also shared the produce. Indeed, when Joan Paget was the only resident in the hall, the gardeners were permitted to sell some of the surplus. Unusually for a walled garden, there is only one wall. Built of red brick in Flemish garden bond, it is 4 metres high and 94 metres long. This provided shelter and support for some of the fruit trees, as well as the 3 messenger greenhouses where flowers for the hall and exotic fruit were grown. The garden sheds were built on the northern side of the wall, housing the greenhouse boiler, as well as the tools, pots, chemicals, and many other items needed to run a garden of this size. They also provided storage for fruit and potatoes. Joan Paget was a lover of flowers and walked down to the walled garden most days. She particularly liked carnations, which were grown in the greenhouses, and Parma violets, which were grown in cold frames in the orchard. Of course, gardens of this size take some looking after, and at one time 8 people were employed in the grounds. Eventually the task was undertaken by just 2 gardeners, Harold Cook, the head gardener, and under gardener Ernest Inchcombe, who spent 52 years in the Pagets' employ. Ernie worked 47 hours a week and alternate weekends to water plants and tend the boiler. When Joan Paget died, there were a couple of attempts at running a market garden, but these proved not to be viable, and by the late 1990s the garden had become a wilderness. The Friends of Nanpantan, and later the Nanpantan Victorian Garden Group, did sterling work to bring the garden and orchard back into good order, but it proved impossible to support the ambitious plans of these groups, relying purely on voluntary labour. So, since 2006, the gardens have been cared for by a small and ever-changing group of volunteers who do what they can to keep the walled garden tidy and in good heart.